Okay, so here we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Peak, and I am the director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's my pleasure to join with you today to welcome you to the Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is made possible with the support of the National Science Foundation and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And we are especially excited to be back with you today because after a relatively brief hiatus, this webinar series was started in 2019 and ran through 2021. Here we are in August 2022, so excited to reignite this series and especially thrilled to be reigniting it with an extraordinary set of panelists from the U.S. Geological Survey and the Bill Anderson Fund, as well as you're going to hear several universities across the nation. And so a couple of announcements before we proceed today with the webinar series. Please note that this forum is being recorded and we post all of the caption recordings as well as the presentation slides up on the Hazard Center Making Mitigation Work website and the particular page for this session. And so we hope that you will go back, revisit this session today, as well as the 20 webinar series from 2019 through 2021 that are available up on the Hazard Center website. And so recording will be available. You can access the past event recordings on our website, as well as several other free resources. So we hope you will check that out. We also want to note that thanks to our ongoing partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, which we are so grateful for, your attendance at this webinar, as well as all future webinars, will earn you 1 contact hour toward your emergency management training certification with IAEM. And so Katie's going to drop in the chat box that link that is on your screen right now to learn more about how the continuing education credits work. And you can also reach out to Katie Murphy directly at the email address that's on your screen and that she'll also put in the chat if you have any questions about that. And the only requirement is that you need to be here for the duration of the live webinar to receive that credit. So thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. And we do hope that you will take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. If at any point during this webinar session today, if you have questions, comments that you want to put forth, you can either use the chat feature and make sure that everyone is selected so that others who are here as part of the webinar can see your questions or comments, or you can direct message the panelists if you so choose, or you can use the Q&A feature on your screen. Dr. Nania Campbell, who is one of our speakers today, is going to be the one who will be moderating the Q&A. So again, feel free to put questions in throughout the session, or you can save them until the end. The wonderful panel we have today is large and robust, but they have left time for conversation, which we found is really important during these webinars. Okay, so without further ado, now we're getting ready for the main event. I'm so excited that we're going to have the opportunity today to hear about the Diversifying HayWired project, which has been all about really addressing a long-standing issue that so many researchers, practitioners, policymakers have been identifying, which is how do we connect with historically marginalized or oppressed populations and communities to improve risk communication opportunities for multiple hazards. Earthquakes is going to be our focus today, but as you're going to hear, many of the lessons are definitely applicable across hazards as well as across geographic and we believe cultural contexts as well. And so we're really excited. You can see on the screen that we have a really incredible lineup of panelists who are going to be speaking with us today, but we're going to start with the one and only Anne Wine with the U.S. Geological Survey, who's going to give us sort of the big picture vision for this project. Then we'll turn it over to Nania Campbell with the Bill Anderson Fund and the Natural Hazard Center, and then each speaker following will introduce themselves. And so Anne, without further ado, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori, the one and only. Okay, I am Anne Wine with the Western Geographic Science Centre of the US Geological Survey, USGS, and I'm briefly going to explain what the HayWired scenario is and what we produced. And then as a segue into this session, what this collaboration with the Bill Anderson Fund Fellows contributes through my role in the USGS. Next slide. The HayWired scenario is a hypothetical and plausible earthquake sequence in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the animation there is showing the ground shaking throughout the aftershock sequence. So red is extreme shaking that will cause heavy and concentrated damage. In retrospect, the 2014 South Napa earthquake is like an aftershock of a magnitude 7 earthquake in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So the wired and HayWired is about testing and strengthening our connectedness. So just like building a house, all kinds of expertise are needed to build a scenario from a foundation of the best available science. We've got landslides, liquefaction, ground shaking, fault rupture, and aftershocks. And through a collaboration with physical scientists, engineers, social scientists, and public and private practitioners in emergency management, critical infrastructure, urban planning, and regional economics, we build the other stories in this building. The engineering implications and social societal consequences. Next slide, since we're having trouble with that one. Being USGS, technical and peer-reviewed analyses are published in 3 volumes about the hazards, the engineering implications, and the societal consequences. And these were produced by hundreds of co-authors, contributors, reviewers, and editors. And then from there, derivative products include distillation of the 3 volumes into 2 fact sheets, a short motivational video, a geo-narrative about the earthquake hazards, and a HayWired webinar connection series. And then we also have a forthcoming exercise toolkit in a partnership with the Earthquake Country Alliance and California Resilience Alliance. So this toolkit then turns the scenario on its head by leading with prompts for earthquake mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, planning, and then supports those questions with information from the HayWired scenario. So despite all this engagement and range of products, we have gaps in who we serve and more gaps than I know. So in reaching diverse communities within hundreds of cities and organizations and representing undeserved populations in the region. So I have to admit that I learn by doing. I don't always know the way forward, but I know we must create spaces to learn and practice scientific investigations and communications to better support underserved communities. So I am extremely grateful to the leadership of Nenia Campbell and the talented Bill Anderson Fund Fellows for fresh perspectives on diversifying HayWired. Although late in the project, this effort is not tagged on, but a process to reflect and inform future projects at the USGS. This effort is broadening perspectives, building relationships, and illustrating tools for tailoring communications. And as one example, I'm honoured and humbled to participate in the USGS Risk and Equity Strategic Approach Plan. So under the direction of Chris Ludwig of the Natural Hazard Mission Area. So that this experience can be brought forth into other ways of USGS moving forward and these ways of conducting science and engaging and communicating with a broader group of communities. And in particular, the underserved. So thanks very much. And Nenia, it's up to you now.
All right, thank you so much, Anne. And again, I'm Nenia Campbell. I am a research associate at the Natural Hazard Center and deputy director of the Bill Anderson Fund. I'm also the principal investigator of the Diversifying HayWired Communication project. And so I'm really excited for the opportunity to share all of this work with you today. I'm going to start us off with a quick introduction of this specific project and some reflections about the team of student researchers that brought it all together, including the unique lens that they were able to draw on to bring that fresh perspective that Anne was talking about to the dissemination of the HayWired scenario. All of the students who contributed to this project were fellows with the William Averitt Anderson Fund, more commonly referenced as the Bill Anderson Fund or BAF. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Bill Anderson Fund is a nonprofit organization that works to expand the number of historically underrepresented professionals in hazards and disaster research, practice, and other related fields. Bill Anderson was a sociologist who dedicated his career toward addressing the disproportionate impacts of disasters on communities that are often underserved, overlooked, or excluded. And the BAF carries on his legacy by building a network of talented minority scholars who are propelling forward the field across diverse academic and professional communities. So as Anne mentioned, this project was developed to support efforts at the U.S. Geological Survey to broaden the reach of the Haywire earthquake scenario by identifying diverse and historically marginalized community stakeholders in the San Francisco Bay Area. This was an iterative, collaborative, and hands-on learning experience that started in the late summer of 2021, and it had three main components, which I'll summarize briefly. Our first step involved data collection phase to characterize the landscape of community-based organizations operating in underserved communities. We focused primarily on those providing services that aligned with the research areas and backgrounds of the 6 BAF Fellows on our team, and ultimately zeroed in on 6 overarching community organizational types. Those included chambers of commerce, financial security programs for lower income communities, energy and environmental justice organizations, public and mental health organizations, and mutual aid networks. This step was designed to collect data via a two-pronged approach of recording publicly available information and then conducting interviews informally with representatives of those organizations to provide additional insights. Unfortunately, our interview efforts were hampered in some respects by challenges that altered our project timeline. So some members of our research team did connect directly with organizational representatives and gather their input, but we primarily relied on our environmental scan and the secondary data sources that were used to populate our database. And those included websites, reports, social media, and other sources. Our next step was to synthesize the information gleaned through that process into design personas or profiles of organizational types that relay key information about those organizations and the populations they serve. And that helped us identify commonalities among their programs and develop a deeper understanding about how they interacted with their service beneficiaries. For the final step, each fellow prototyped an information product that was tailored to a specific organizational type and the client base that they served. And the products channeled relevant findings from the Haywired scenario into these creative designs that could then serve as a gateway to greater engagement between these organizations and the Haywired Coalition. And their prototype concepts drew on this knowledge base that we had created to identify opportunities and pathways for reaching those new target audiences that were not typically plugged into the kinds of dissemination channels that have been used in the past. This process as a whole, as well as our reflections and observations, have been written up in a report that's available on the project webpage, which is linked also on the webinar webpage. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on how the characteristics of this student research team enhanced the project's overall innovative potential. First, this was a multidisciplinary group that included fellows studying a range of disciplines from emergency management to urban and regional science, computer and electrical engineering to public administration. And they brought those really varied perspectives to bear on the project. Second, the fellows also brought to the table their past professional, academic, and personal experience, which expanded further into earthquake preparedness, business and finance, public health, renewable energy, and community outreach and engagement. And then finally, as fellows with the Bill Anderson Fund, each of the students drew on a fundamental concern and familiarity with the disproportionate impacts of disasters on marginalized communities, as well as a mutual dedication toward exploring new approaches that can help to reduce those disparities. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the project team members themselves to the virtual stage and have them talk about their designs and shed light on the thought process that went into them. So first up, we have Jean-Claude Ndongo, and Jean-Claude, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Again, I'm Jean-Claude Ndongo, BAF Fellow, and I'm a PhD student in public administration at Florida Atlantic University. Next slide, please. The organization type that I have picked for my part of the project is made up of chambers of commerce, and their final audience is made up of businesses from marginalized communities. The chambers of commerce are networks made up of businesses, for-profit and nonprofit, and also public agencies. For this project, I've focused on the Oakland Chamber of Commerce and the Hayward Chamber of Commerce as well. Those chambers provide information on business planning and also financing, and a lot of them have initiatives to assist businesses from marginalized communities as well. Those businesses from marginalized communities often do not have information on earthquake preparedness. They often lack financial resources or personnel to prepare for earthquakes or even recover from them. And they often do not have a disaster plan in place. In terms of communication, a lot of those businesses communicate through social media, through text messages and emails, but they also belong to several networks, such as the Black Business Roundtable, which is a part of the Hayward Chamber of Commerce. Next slide, please. Now, why chambers of commerce? The mission of most chambers, for one, is to secure the economic future of the communities that they serve. Chambers of commerce aim to enhance the quality of life in the city in which they are located. And most of them believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important to the economic future of the cities that they serve. Going back to the Oakland Chamber as well as the Hayward Chamber, they've expressed their commitment to marginalized communities in the Bay Area. The Oakland Chamber, for example, supports business creation and sustainability for Bay Area residents who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the Hayward Chamber has specifically shown support for marginalized businesses by providing access to a network, funding, and also planning services. And overall, chambers of commerce communicate also through websites, via social media, flyers, and also by hosting community events. Next slide, please. So the product idea that I came up with will be a mascot. The objective of the mascot will be to have a friendly, inclusive, and interactive character that can fulfill two roles. One will be being the spokesperson for the HayWired scenario, and the second role will be of a representative of the partnership among the different agencies that collaborate for the HayWired scenario. The mascot will attend different events, and those events could be held at the Chambers of Commerce, various business locations, various community events such as community fairs or back-to-school events, for example, that may be sponsored by the businesses, and also disaster recovery events around the city. Next slide, please. So the mascot will serve as a connector between the Chambers of Commerce, the chamber members, those various entities, and also marginalized communities. Chambers of Commerce inherently interconnect businesses, and they also interact with the communities. So again, they could host the mascot at different events. Chamber members, a lot of those businesses, for example, and other agencies, usually have community service initiatives. They can also partner with the mascot during some of those initiatives, and some may also serve as suppliers for disaster, as sponsors for disaster supplies. Marginalized communities, who obviously, people in marginalized communities who interact with mascots, the mascot at different events. Those that own businesses will engage in business networking, and some of those businesses might also be the recipients of disaster-related supplies. Next slide, please. So introducing the mascot that I came up with, the mascot will be a bear known as Geo. So Geo the bear will carry a backpack, and the backpack will contain several items, starting with the HayWired Business Exercise Toolkit, earthquake preparedness and recovery supplies, a checklist for supplies, a tablet or laptop to access disaster apps and videos, as well as a disaster board game. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, Geo will be the ultimate connector. Geo will be a connector between different information products that are all related to the four categories of the emergency management cycle, which are disaster preparedness, disaster response, disaster recovery, and hazard mitigation. Now, before I pass it on to my colleague, Paula, who will discuss mitigation and preparedness, just wanted to mention that my idea of this portion of the project was inspired by my prior professional experience in banking and finance, where I've had the opportunity to learn about the importance of community engagement, networking, and the pursuit of social equity. So during the Q&A session, I can also further discuss the next step as I'm developing another initiative from this project. So I'll pass it on to Paula at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. I am Paula Buchanan. I'm a disaster scientist and emergency management researcher. My work lies at the intersection of public health, education, and communications. And my research focuses on public education and outreach efforts and the risk communication messages that should be contained there to more effectively educate and inform the diverse populations about disasters. So let's get started with the presentation. Next slide, please. The targeted audiences for this project are low-income, working-class communities of color in the Bay Area, including undocumented immigrants. These targeted audiences were chosen because these groups have a history of having low social equity and are often marginalized and minoritized by society. This demographic also experiences systemic racism and marginalization, expresses poverty, especially in their decreased access to housing and generational wealth, and their increased vulnerability to disasters. Next slide, please. Financial security programs that provide services in these low-income communities of color are the organization type chosen for this project. These organizations understand the various types of barriers low-income communities of color experience and must be prepared to step in and aid these communities when disasters strike. These organizations also understand the importance of financial security before, during, and after disasters. Next slide, please. Now, onto the information product. My information product is designed to address specific pain points experienced by the aforementioned communities, such as lack of financial support and historic marginalization, by addressing the communication challenges of sharing information and other resources with these communities to help them more effectively mitigate and prepare for disasters. Next slide, please. My information product is a combination of the Choose Your Own Adventure young adult fiction books, if anyone enjoyed those like I did as a child, and a Create Your Own board game product to introduce, next slide, a Choose Your Own Disaster board game with Geo the Bear from Jean-Claude as a game piece and or part of the artwork of the game. The Choose Your Own Disaster board game uses gamification. Gamification is defined as the application of typical elements of game playing to encourage engagement with a product or service. As an information product based on gamification, the Choose Your Own Disaster board game helps communities more effectively navigate the process of accessing disaster assistance information and other related resources. Next slide. Versions of the Choose Your Own Disaster board game focus on different disaster types, from earthquakes to floods to wildfires, and are produced for multiple types of communication platforms, such as the physical board game itself and a potential mobile phone app version of the game. Each version of the Choose Your Own Disaster board game focuses on the proactive phases of emergency management, that is mitigation and preparedness, that occur again before disasters. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, Geo the Bear from Jean-Claude and the Choose Your Own Disaster board game from me series provide information product synergy with the potential to connect all information products under one theme, while also having information products at all 4 phases of emergency management. The next phase of the Choose Your Own Disaster board game project involves conducting an environmental scan to specifically determine who plays the game. For example, do clients play the game together? Do organizations play the game with clients, or possibly a mixture of both? Next slide, please. As a disaster scientist and emergency management researcher, working on this product has added to the foundation of work that I've previously conducted to further increase knowledge about risk communication as a part of disaster mitigation and preparedness. To learn more about my work in the risk communication space, visit my website below. Thank you for your time, and now on to the next presenter.
And next up, we have Mojib Bello.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mojib Bello. I'm a PhD candidate from electrical and computer engineering from Morgan State University. I'm a part of a BAF Fellow. My project focuses on the energy upgrade to support the post-disaster communication for low-income and minority community in the Bay Area, which assists from Energy Justice Organization. Next slide. So the population I want to reach out with information products include the historical underrepresented minority and low-income household and homeowners. The HayWired scenario show that income minority community are more likely to be experience power and telecommunication outage following a large earthquake. The driver their disaster vulnerability also reduced their access to clean and renewable energies. These populations are more likely white or influential community that be affected by pollution caused by fossil fuel, or to be suffer or the impact of climate change, and to exclude from the from economic opportunity like internet connectivity and digital communication. So the other side of it is they are also likely to face the difficulty of paying household utility bill on one day or the other, or can be, they can benefit from the Energy Justice Program offering affordable access or low cost solar or assistant programs. So to help this to help it reach the community, I decided to focus on energy justice organization in Bay Area. So next slide. Before designing this my information product, I made sure that I focus on I make sure that the outreach strategy that I made is I think about what its population need in order to increase the earthquake preparedness, and then the low income and minority community are often unprepared for disaster due to the lack of resources. So this population also likely to be displaced from their home or need to get in touch with their family, friend, and employers. But I put some of solution to the energy grid and technification failure. Need to be inexperienced to be produced, but also like the instruction for any solution need to be easy to be lay hands on people to create for use in some emergency situations. So next slide. We found out that there are many organizations that already work directly with marginalized and the minority community to increase their access to clean energy and technology in Bay Area. These organizations are ideally organizations to provide information to the community they have served about how to access the alternative form of power in the aftermath of the earthquake or any disaster. This organization can teach the people how they teach people they serve about how to become more prepared using the available or low cost resources, like to get to back into the power when they have a power outage. The Energy and Environmental Justice Organization work to bring clean energy solution to the marginalized community by providing available clean energy system. Digital Divide Organization, which work with low-income community to obtain access and communication technology and promote digital literacy. Both type of these organizations are likely to have existing relationship with target communities. They are also likely to have the skill to be able to understand of the design of my own information product and teach their clients how to build or use one. So next slide. This is information product. My information product is a flywheel or a simple device that can build using the common household materials to generate energy that can be used to charge cell phone or other small electronics during a power outage or power failure. The product includes the list of supply to build a flywheel. This include the inductor motor, woods, household brake fans, or bicycle, capacitor, rechargeable battery, or with the 2 terminal of cable or wires. Because this large earthquake will likely cause telecommunication network breakdown. The product also includes the instruction to use this cell phone, the cell phone to test instead of making a phone call, because the energy that's going to be producing might be low to just charge your phone for a while to communicate emergency agency. This will help people to understand how to work around the destruction or conserve energy and work around the common problem. We have to construct a simple wood-based mount and then hold the inductor motor, and then also connect the drive rod that we call a shaft to the flywheel, and then or a bicycle or fan blade. And the other means is you have to connect after you connect the flywheel and the motor, you have to connect the terminal. Terminal is the wire that you're going to connect your phone to charge. And the organization can hold house workshop with this resident to demonstrate how to build this flywheel and even build some of it in advance for the energy preparedness or post-disaster. Next slide. In my conclusion, throughout this project, we learn about the common barrier to access available clean energy among the low-income and minority community in the Bay Area. We also learn that several organizations working with community to address energy security, economic need, and access to telecommunication at any disaster or any situation that happen in a natural disaster. I'm an engineer. I'm not a social scientist, but so I use this knowledge of energy generation to develop a product that will be useful as a resources and disaster preparedness education to the member of vulnerable communities. And I developed a plan to use this existing organization resources and the relations that can serve as a partner to the HayWired team to reach this population and support their earthquake or post-disaster preparedness. Next slide. Thank you. My emails, if you have any question, or you can contact me on this product. Thank you so much. Next presenter.
And next up, we have Takira Mims.
Hello, I am Takira Mims. I'm a DRPH student at the Texas A&M School of Public Health. Next slide, please. I focused on organizations that provide services to marginalized communities, including racial and ethnic minorities and low-income populations. These organizations include public health institutions, healthcare facilities, and community health organizations. I selected these organizations because they play a key role in emergency preparedness and response efforts. They also have established networks for delivering services. They have relationships with local communities and understand the needs of their constituents. They have avenues for communication distribution, and they have the ability to respond quickly and effectively to local issues. Next slide. Thank you. The Hayward earthquake scenario demonstrates that hundreds of thousands of people in the San Francisco Bay region would be forcibly displaced by damage to the built environment, fires, and other immediate hazards. The populations these health entities serve may be unaware of their risk or unable to implement preventative measures, such as retrofitting their home or purchasing emergency rations. In the event of a large-scale earthquake, marginalized communities may be disproportionately affected by displacement, loss of communications, transportation services, and utilities. Communities may need access to physical and mental health services, in addition to interim housing solutions. They may also need access to resources such as face masks to protect themselves from environmental hazards and to prevent the spread of pathogens, especially during pandemic. Public health entities and healthcare facilities are in a unique position to disseminate information to these communities before, during, and after an event. They can disseminate disaster information via their websites, social media platforms, community programs, and preparedness activities. Next slide. Thank you. So I chose to create a video to help health professionals in the Bay Area better understand the needs of their constituents before, during, and after an earthquake. So this video demonstrates an easy to use platform that can be used to jumpstart a conversation about risk and emergency preparations. And this slide and the next slide, it just shows some screenshots of the video that you just saw. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this video can incorporate other information products that you'll see today, such as Geo the Bear and the Disaster Board Game. It can also be embedded into web applications. And the goal of the video is to provide tailored information, which can be used by health professionals to educate their clients and inform their organizational earthquake response measures. Once complete, I hope this video can be used to increase awareness of local hazards among health professionals and their clients. Next slide. My interest in learning more about the preparedness needs of vulnerable populations, including the deaf community, the unhoused, and the incarcerated, is what made me pursue a doctorate in public health and to become a Bill Anderson Fund Fellow. This research project gave me the opportunity to speak with organizations that serve these populations and to learn more about their specific needs during a disaster event. I believe that health entities have specific skill sets and resources that may be helpful to community preparedness and response efforts. They excel at connecting individuals to resources, engaging target populations, generating culturally competent risk communications, developing strategic partnerships, and leveraging resources. So engaging health entities in emergency preparedness work provides avenues for them to further get involved and build trust with the communities that they serve. Thank you for listening. And now I will hand it over to a fellow Aggie, Jennifer.
Thank you, Takira. So I will go ahead and make my slides as quickly and thorough as possible. I'm Jennifer Blanks. I'm a PhD candidate at Texas A&M University, and I co-created my products with Judan, who will be giving follow-up once I'm done and further expand or explain the products. So our target audience collectively were community organizers and small businesses, mutual aid networks, wider community members, neighborhood watch groups, church organizations, just small, intimate networks that would have a lot of knowledge on how to share resources and knowing what resources the community actually needs during and post-disaster. Next slide, please. So why did we select this target audience? Well, these types of networks were created during systemic neglection or systemic ignorance by the government in depriving communities of resources. And so you have these networks like church organizations and community centers kind of emerge and pioneer how to distribute and locate resources for those constituents in their community. Again, distrust with state officials, kind of a broken relationship, but we're finding that this is a opportunity to kind of repair that relationship to those wider networks. And again, these networks have intimate knowledge about the community that they work with and really knowing who needs what resources and the best ways to distribute those resources. Next slide, please. And so one product that me and Judan created was creating a mobile app, and it seems so simple, but we think mobile apps are a great tool or resource that can be used during disaster management. In terms of the HayWired scenario, we foresee the app containing social media content, linking all or streamlining all of those social media networks like Twitter and Facebook, so folks can be connected with the organization in that way and getting information in real time on those platforms, but also sharing multimedia content like training videos. The communication video that Takir created, for example, could be a tool uploaded into the app or a series of infographics, and even having some kind of radio connection, because radio connections are really important during disasters. And then also sharing lists of resources like shelters and where active fault lines, where the aftershocks occurring following the earthquake, and different evacuation maps and evacuation routes, but also showing maps that are hotspots for distributing resources. And next slide. And I will be passing it to Jan, who will further explain our products.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Hi, my name is Jadan, and I'm a third-year urban and regional science student focused on collaborative planning and citizen science in hazard and mitigation research and emergency management. So we're focusing on mutual aids, and that's because mutual aids have been a feature of the San Francisco Bay Area for a long time, and we saw how much they emerged and play a role after COVID. So when a large earthquake happens, like the one described in the HayWired scenario, there's often a lot of displacement and loss and injury, and those minority communities are pilloried by those effects, and they have been repeatedly impacted by disasters and also just being systematically disenfranchised. So the mutual aid networks now, they step in as some type of resistance and a provision of collective care to these communities. Right, so these mutual aids, they provide care and material need, emotional support to persons who traditionally cannot access some relief, who cannot access it in time or are unable to benefit from other philanthropic relief areas because of, maybe issues with incarceration, maybe they're unhoused, sex workers. So sometimes philanthropic support has conditions, and some of these community members are unable to meet those needs. So mutual aid networks step in as a means to provide care to these communities. Because they arise out of need, they are traditionally or most times left out of the pre-disaster and post-disaster recovery planning process. But because they form such an intimate link with communities, it would be important for them to be more involved and to at least have a baseline of information in after an earthquake to help their communities. So using the design personas methodology that we discussed earlier, we assess the risk communication needs of mutual aid networks, and we analyze their pain points, their target audiences, who they serve, and at what phase they do their most work. And for mutual aids, they actually span up the entire disaster management cycle for the most part. They're right there after the event. And they're most times in there for the long haul because of the range of services that they provide. But because they're localized networks, they're often underfunded. A lot of pre-positioning does not happen. There's not a lot of succession planning in some mutual aid networks, at least the smaller, more intimate ones. So having their risk communication needs developed and outlined in a responsive information product was important to fit into the HayWired scenario if we're intending to meet more communities that are often left out of the disaster management process. So with that, we developed a checklist that would play a role in creating some type of baseline information on the needs after an earthquake. Next slide, please. So the checklist is to be used as a knowledge sharing and mobilizing feature. It could be done in print and also inputted into and combined with other previous products. For example, put in Geo the Bear's backpack. It could be subsumed into Jennifer's application. It could be a part of the gamification process in Paula's products. So all of these products, although different and although created on their own, somehow have managed to mirror each other based on the needs of the communities that we're targeting. So the checklist is created with the anticipated needs and just some baseline things that would be required for mutual aids to pre-position and also to solicit from other communities that want to give resources. We also know that the logistical, craziness of donations is also a feature of earthquakes, because a lot of persons want to give, but they're not necessarily sure what to give. So the checklist also functions in that way. And these are expected outcomes from the checklist, and from Jennifer's products. We're anticipating some increased preparedness activities, better ability to respond, and also continuity of these local grassroots organizations. And we're trying to also increase risk awareness, but also be cognizant of the fact that these agencies and these organizations are smaller, less resources, and probably don't have established disaster plans. Thank you. Oh, my personal reflection, I almost forgot. So yeah, I think for the most part, what I got from this project is the importance of cultural responsiveness in risk communication, and the importance of being aware of the group that you're trying to serve. I think Jennifer and I both found out that these organizations have different needs, and to fully encapsulate those needs in the information products, we had to be knowledgeable of the issues that they were facing. For some of the next steps, for me personally, we're continuing this work with HayWired and focusing on localized community-based organizations as per usual, which is my research area, but focusing it on food security issues, which are very widespread in the East Bay area, and connecting that to seismic resilience. So, this work is something that's dear to me, and we'll continue to build it out and to better serve these communities. Thank you.
All right, and I think we're ready to transition into the Q&A portion of the discussion. I saw that, so please do add your questions either to the chat box or to Q&A. I noticed that there was one request for contact information for the panelists. So for the fellows, if you, I know you had it on your slides, but if you wouldn't mind adding your contact information to the chat, that would be lovely. Also, I saw that to start off, we had a question from Lori about elaborating on the design personas. And so I can really briefly go through that process as we get some of the other questions from the audience. But those personas basically were the products we used to boil down the information we covered we obtained in the environmental scan. So about how organizations were communicating with their clients, what some of the pain points were for delivering the services to the communities that they serve, what were their skills, what kinds of things were they really adept at doing. And that helped us synthesize this information and really identify those commonalities across the organizations. So you can actually see examples of those design personas in the report that's linked on the webinar webpage. So I encourage everyone to go through and have a look at those. I'm not sure if I answered all of the information that you wanted about those, Lori, but that's a quick overview of the design personas. And I see we have some other questions coming through in the Q&A. Some of the responses have been given in the chat, but I don't know if anybody wanted to elaborate on anything. I saw, Paula, that you had, for example, a few questions about your game concept. Would you like to go over that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I apologize for everyone. I had to find my mute button. So one of the things that I've actually done before, because I've been in this space before, I was with BAF. I actually used to work in IT, and I actually worked in gaming. So I used a lot of that knowledge that I already had for this project, specifically, for example, just knowing about the concept of gamification and some of the leading authors on gamification, but specifically in the field of business, since I have an MBA like Jean-Claude. So that's what I kind of use as my basis of, why I framed everything the way I did. And looks like we have some specific questions also about BAF, Nania.
Yes, I will be getting to that in just a moment. I will add a link to the chat box with the application period, which is now currently open until the 14th of August for the Bill Anderson Fund. So I will add that link to the chat box, but you can go to our website, billandersonfund.org/apply, and for more information on how to become a BAF Fellow and the eligibility criteria. And again, the application deadline is August 14th. There was also a question, I believe, about the components of the flywheel concept and what the vision was there. And Mojid, I know you mentioned briefly that this was intended to use materials that were already around or that were low cost. Did you want to elaborate on anything there?
Yes, thank you, everyone. The product is going to be based on a leftover after the disaster or post-disaster, just to make sure if you want to prepare post-disaster, it's not going to be something you have to buy or you have to purchase. It might be part of the breakdown, fan, household materials. So the motto is the inductor model that everybody has a little fan or something like a portable heater or something that have a fan. So the heater is when it breaks down, so that's what you're going to use as your model. The flywheel can be like something like a leftover blade or something of the fan or something. And then the battery, if you have a battery, if you don't have the battery, it's supposed to use any alkaline soft, like they can, like a capacitor. Capacitor is leftover, it's inside the fan too. So you can store the energy. So when you store the energy, and then that's why you connect the energy that you store into the cable, and then the cable is going to be charging your phone. So that's just it. And the flywheel is just to generate energy. The capacitor or the battery is to store the energy, and then the wire, the cable is to take the energy that you store into your phone. It's just, thanks. Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, Mojid. We had a question for Takira just about elaborating on how you, and you answered it in the chat, but I wanted to know if you'd like to mention how you envision the video being used and disseminated.
Of course. So I envision it being used initially as a product to make health providers aware of the challenges that their communities will be facing in the event of a large scale earthquake, and kind of give them some practical knowledge and also a basis to start those conversations. So that's how I envision it being implemented. And as far as it being shared, as I mentioned, there's websites, social media platforms, professional forums to disseminate this information on. And I would really like to see it implemented as a part of a training curriculum for health professionals, as part of a larger discussion of emergency preparedness and mitigation for their clients.
Wonderful, thank you. And we also had a question from Dave Jones about overcoming communities' lack of trust in federal or state data or information. And Judan started responding to that in text, but Judan, would you like to come off mute and talk a little bit more about your thoughts there?
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that, it's important that we involve community members on the front end and even project design. I know when we think about, the project schedule and funds and, things that are finite, sometimes that process seems overwhelming or are not the route most traveled. But I think if you're looking for a project that is going to have that impact and is going to have that buy-in and ownership, that we need to involve community members on the front end as partners and not necessarily only recipients of this supposed project, help these communities or allow the community to help you craft something that is fit for their needs and not necessarily for them to be bogged down with what you think that community needs. And those strident steps will help to chip away at distrust and like the overall perception of neglect from federal and state agencies in these marginalized communities.
And would anybody else on the panel like to speak to that issue? I will say also that we started off with this process going through a really iterative process, really learning about the organizations, incorporating that into our strategy. And we were building on some of the best practices for risk communication that are linked in the webinar webpage. There's a whole separate project that's related to social vulnerability and communicating risk to socially vulnerable populations. And that emphasis that Judan was talking about on engaging communities, on having that collaborative approach is broken down in some of those resources and materials. I'll add a link to the chat for that specific project and the resources that have been developed as part of that project. But addressing issues of distrust is not something that's going to happen overnight, right? And so having that humility to work with communities, to listen to their concerns and their critiques and respond honestly to those is really important. So in some of those risk communication guidance materials, we talk about that process of how do you do that, how you do that outreach to communities, the importance of active listening, and there's some good resources there as well.
If I may add, as far as distrust and just the importance of building relationships, that's one of the lessons that I believe we all have learned, and especially as I was going through putting together my part of the project, I realized how important relationship building and also networking is, which then takes me to a question that I believe Norma has asked as far as the next steps for us researchers. So personally, I'm developing a follow-up initiative that's centered around the impact of networking among large businesses, large mainstream businesses, and small minority-owned businesses, and networking through chambers of commerce. And as I'm developing that project, I also realized the importance of cultural responsiveness, which Judan and Jennifer both mentioned during the presentation as well.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Before we move on to another question, anything else along those lines that anybody wants to share about that issue of distrust or building trust with marginalized communities?
I'll speak. I know specifically for healthcare providers, it is a touchy topic when we talk about trust with communities. So I see health care entities being involved on the front end of emergency preparations for their communities as a way to come to them with their concerns in mind and just let the communities know that, hey, we recognize that this is a need and we are working with you and bringing this information on the front end, and then we'll also be there for you during the actual mitigation and recovery and all the other steps that come after that. So I see it as a way of like getting ahead of the needs that the community will need before a disaster actually happens.
Thank you, Taikira. And there was also a question about, you've all touched on the ways in which you're kind of building on your projects or where you see them going in the future. Does anybody want to elaborate, for those of you who have continued on with your work, Jean-Claude or Judan or Paula, about next steps for how you're continuing to build on your work, where you would like to see it go?
Sure, I'll start first and I'll make it quickly because I think we're running over time. But I'm basically using what I've already created as a foundation. And right now, what I'm going to be doing is extending the environmental scan, looking specifically at gaming resources and gamification resources. And then using that to create a literature review to find more evidence on how, not only how these games are created, but also how they are evaluated.
And we're rounding out our time here. Any last thoughts that, or you feel like you covered it sufficiently, Judan and Jean-Claude?
Yeah, I think I did mention that I'm looking at food organizations, and specifically not large food banks, but more like mom and pop pantries, mobile food organizations, and seeing how they square up against the exposed areas that will be most impacted in an earthquake, and trying to build out their information needs for seismic resilience. So that's where I am. And I think something that's important is that the reason why we focus on these communities is that while they're vulnerable, and I know vulnerability is a huge part of disaster research. Like we need to think of these communities as having their own adaptive capacities to fix the issues that they have. So speaking with them and learning from them is the best way that we can build out suitable solutions with them as partners.
And if I can add in a few seconds, I'm working on expanding my network in the Bay Area to, for one, learn what's already being done on the ground in terms of networking and in terms of relationship building between different entities, including small businesses and also financial institutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. So I just have a quick little wrap up for us here since we are at time. In addition to thanking the Bill Anderson Fund and the USGS for this amazing presentation, we'd also like to give thanks to the National Science Foundation and also the Federal Emergency Management Agency for making this webinar series possible. And then we would love you all to hold your September 13th date in your calendars for our next Making Mitigation Work webinar series. And you can also sign up at our sign up page for future mail services for that listserv. So thank you all so much. We will wrap up with any questions that weren't answered for panelists afterwards. And we hope that you will take care of yourself and others. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you all for joining.